talk about maybe fraud risk assessments and compliance risk assessments. Seems to
Oh,
be kind of there seems to be some, I'll call it market confusion out there, but at first glance they probably seem to be pretty similar. Both deal with risk controls and governance, but the truth is that they truly are pretty different. And I get into this debate with people all the time. Tom, and you and I were talking about this before, but they're different in purpose. They're definitely different in methodology, and they're certainly they're different in impact. They do complement one another in some way, but from my perspective, the compliance risk assessment helps you answer the question, are we following the laws, regulations, and internal policies we're required to follow? And a fraud risk assessment goes a little bit deeper, and it asks, could someone intentionally break those rules, deceive others, and harm the organization? And would we even detect it in time? That's when I'm talking to people, that's kind of how I lay it out. And the difference to me is critical because compliance without fraud detection is it's locking your front door of your house while leaving the back door wide open. And again, I just think that there's some confusion there. But let's go back to the whole purpose of all this and the fraud risk assessment piece of this. It's really a structured process that is designed to identify, assess, and prioritize fraud acts or fraud schemes that could harm the organization. But unfortunately, like I mentioned, many organizations even get this wrong. They treat fraud literally like another line item in a compliance checklist, focusing really only on controls or financial reporting. That approach really misses the most important element, and that's the mindset of the fraudster, or as I like to say, the mind behind the crime. So a strong fraud, for those that are listening out there, I'm going to give you some guidance, but a strong fraud risk assessment begins with starting with the act itself, like I mentioned. So the act is really the fraud scheme. So you identify the key fraud schemes that could occur in your organization. For instance, false vendor setups, revenue inflation, insider collusion, or improper use of restricted funds. These are the how behind the fraud. Then there's the concealment. I'll get back to this in a second, but that's really how it's hidden. So fraud is rarely overt, right? For a lot of reasons. And those that are just brazen enough to let it out there, they have their own problems. But perpetrators, at least deliberately, initially, also try to hide their actions. So they might manipulate data, falsify documents, book bogus journal entries, override controls, or even exploit process weaknesses that are really that actually bury the evidence of the wrongdoing. And then there's the conversion. So why would you do this? Usually for personal gain. I can't explain why some people actually do this, even though their personal gain is meaningless. But it's really how that scheme is converted into a bet to the benefit of the bad actor. And whether it's cash, inflated bonuses, promotions, reputational enhancement, there's always a payoff that motivates the deception, at least from my experience. And from there, we map how these schemes interact with critical business processes and identify gatekeepers. And I'll get back to that in a second. But those are really the individuals that have the authority to approve or review transactions. And this is really a critical step in this process. There are points of control where fraud can either be stopped or they could slip through undetected. And a lot has to do with skills and capabilities, which I'm not going to talk about today. So let's talk about some red flags for a second, because I think the next step in this is really red flags. So in this stage of the fraud risk assessment, it's critical to evaluate those red flags. And those are early warning signs of potentially something that's not right. Doesn't necessarily mean that there's fraud, but they're just warning signs. And I break them out into 4 distinct categories: data, documents, lack of controls, and behavior. I'm not going to get into all the minutiae behind them. You can read those online for yourself at some point. I believe I've written about this maybe 100 times. But just for example, like data red flags, transactions that have unusual times, transactions that are unusual or frequent or rare in occurrence. Then we have document red flags, missing or altered documents, for example, approving expense reports without receipts, lack of controls or red flags, so inadequate segregation of duties and the like. And then there's behavioral red flags, employees living behind their means. You've heard all these before. Employees facing personal stressors. That doesn't happen today at all. Yeah, who are we kidding ourselves? So connecting the red flags to controls is really the next process. And once the red flags are identified, we evaluate whether the controls are truly built to actually detect and deter that particular behavior. And many organizations rely on controls designed for compliance, which are great for catching unintentional errors, but fraud is intentional. And this is the problem we've been facing all along: is people get confused about control design. Number one, they don't even know what an internal control means. Matt Kelly can tell you all about that. But more importantly, they don't even understand what it actually can or should be doing. But you can't view this in a vacuum. So the questions that I always say to people is this risk one organizations are willing to accept if we identify something? If not, how might we mitigate or transfer that particular risk? And who owns the responsibility for managing it? Like I said, this really doesn't happen in a vacuum. And fraud really thrives where oversight is weak, rationalizations are generally strong, and culture turns a blind eye or just doesn't exist at all. So when executed properly, the fraud risk assessment produces more than just a report. It provides really a strategic roadmap for fraud. I don't like to use the word prevention. I like the word deterrence because whatever, but I'll say prevention here. But it does provide a strategic roadmap for fraud prevention, early detection, and it actually enhances and helps organizational resilience. So what about a compliance risk assessment? Compliance risk assessment, while related, serves a completely different purpose. It's about ensuring that organizations are meeting their legal, regulatory, and policy obligations. So what that typically involves is obviously identifying those applicable obligations, assessing exposure, and then evaluating processes and controls, and then prioritizing corrective actions. So regulations like the Department of Justice often focus on these three questions, right? Is your program well designed? We haven't heard these before. Is it implemented in good faith? And does it work in practice? And I like to think of it this way. Compliance risk assessments confirm you're coloring inside the lines. Fraud risk assessments force you to think like someone intentionally coloring outside the lines and trying to get away with it. So I think that's a different way of thinking of it, but I think it's pretty simple. But the biggest mistake organizations make is assuming that the compliance risk assessment automatically covers the fraud risk assessment. And I'm telling you right now, it absolutely doesn't. And the key differences are there, or the key differentiators are focus on intent versus process. Compliance asks, are we following the rules? Fraud asks, could someone deliberately subvert those rules to benefit themselves? Again, going back to that, the three things that I mentioned before, the three elements. The scope of the risk, compliant focuses narrowly on regulatory exposure. In most cases, fraud looks broadly at financial, operational, reputational threats, including internal and external bad actors. There is some crossover, yes, but I'm going over these fundamentally. From a methodology perspective, compliance relies heavily on surveys and documentation. Fraud leverages forensic tools like interviews, analytics, and behavioral red flag mapping. Compliance does use some of those same things, but I think it's more on the fraud side than it is the compliance side. And from an outcome perspective, compliance produces policies and certifications, and fraud creates actionable real-time detection and prevention strategies. Like I said, they do complement one another. Taking it beyond to a one-dimensional process, if you're truly utilizing your fraud risk assessment, those red flags that I talked about, data, documents, lack of controls, and behavior, those should be embedded in your training. That's what people should be learning on. If you walk into an FCPA seminar and someone says the FCPA was enacted in the 1970s, you should immediately leave. But if they start talking about what the red flags are and they start talking about data, documents, lack of controls, and behavior, and they get into all the particulars, then I think you're probably going to learn something. And I think by doing this, you transform this static risk assessment into something that's multidimensional. It's multidimensional, and it builds awareness, and it builds detection, and it builds that fundamental concept that we like to call continuous improvement. So I'm going to wrap it up, I promise. I know I have diarrhea in the mouth today, but the compliance risk assessment ensures your organization is following the rules, and a fraud risk assessment protects you from those who would deliberately break them. So just remember that this really isn't a project. I like to say it's not a set it and forget it exercise. It's a living and breathing process that will strengthen your organization over time. But I guess just in closing out my segment, bringing it all back together, compliance really keeps you lawful, and fraud risk management keeps you safe.
Any questions or comments for Mr. Marks? I have one.
Sure.
Jonathan, do you need, you're talking about the difference in the focus in a compliance risk assessment and a fraud risk assessment. What about the person who does the risk assessment? Should you have a fraud risk examiner, a certified fraud risk examiner, a forensic accountant, or someone with that specialization or not?
I'll flip the script on you. If you're going to do a compliance risk assessment, should you have someone who's a lawyer or who specializes in compliance and has the skills, knowledge, and experience to do the compliance risk assessment? I think the answer to your question is absolutely, but not, you don't, look, the certifications are lovely. They truly are. I get a ton of them. I would throw them all in the freaking trash, to be honest with you. I think the real meat and potatoes here is the fact that I've been there. I've done that. I've been in the trenches. I've skinned my knees. I've broken my nose. I've got poked in the eye and kicked all over my body. So I kind of understand what's going on. And for those people that are doing these things, they have to have those experiences. Otherwise, you won't understand a red flag from a yellow flag or a red flag from a blue flag. I'm a firm believer in the folks that are doing this stuff should have that skills, knowledge, and experience. That's the standard that I would set for anybody. If you're a lawyer and you have experience in compliance and you've built compliance programs and you've tested those compliance programs and you've been involved in assessing risk across the organization, I'm sure you're qualified to do a compliance risk assessment. But on the same token, that same individual, if they don't have any idea what fraud risk is or how to design an internal control, stay in your own lane, please. And you bring up a bigger point. So now you're going to get me on my soapbox. Is everyone's hiring for compliance professionals and they want them to be lawyers? That's wonderful, but I think that's just one piece. So I'm forced to understand the law from what I do. I would never say that I'm an expert in anything because I'm not. But I understand what needs to be done, and probably better than most.